Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a case that, well, it's often cited as one of the most compelling and, frankly, legally challenging true crime stories in modern Australian history.
Absolutely. And this isn't a story defined by, a dramatic discovery or some big forensic breakthrough.
No, exactly. It's defined by a systematic, profound absence, the absence of a body.
Yeah.
We're diving into the facts and the legal mechanics behind the conviction of Keli Lane.
Keli Lane, convicted for the 1996 disappearance and ultimately the presumed murder of her newborn daughter, Tegan Lee Lane.
This is really the anatomy of a conviction secured entirely through circumstantial evidence. It's built on concealment, ambition, and just a staggering pattern of lies.
And that framework, the reliance on pattern of life over physical evidence, that's precisely why this case is such a critical study,
Right.
Our mission today is really to track the highly unconventional legal path taken here. We'll start with Lane's almost unbelievable ability to hide 5 pregnancies. 5. Then we'll move through the exhaustive and ultimately fruitless multi-year police investigation.
Which was massive.
Huge. And finally, we'll look at the landmark 2010 murder conviction itself. And we also need to understand the very current application of the no body, no parole laws that are defining her incarceration right now.
Okay, so the initial facts really set the scene immediately, don't they? Keli Lane, born 1975. On the surface, she seemed like this highly successful, ambitious Australian woman.
Yeah, a former water polo player, a teacher, a very public-facing image.
But in 2010, she was convicted of murdering newborn Tegan Lee Lane, who vanished within just 48 hours of her birth back in September 1996. And there were also 3 counts of making a false declaration.
And it's important to note, the High Court of Australia denied her final application to appeal in August 2014. That really confirmed the verdict's integrity within the legal system, despite the lack of a body.
Which is crucial.
And as you mentioned, this isn't just history. The case remains a current legal reality. She was sentenced to 18 years, but that no body, no parole law kicked in hard recently.
In March 2024, right?
That's right. March 2024, she was denied her initial parole eligibility. So she's essentially locked into continued incarceration unless she cooperates in locating Tegan.
Which, given her stance, seems like the ultimate catch-22.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. We really need to understand the life Lane seems so desperate to protect because the contrast between her public persona and her private life is just, well, it's staggering.
It really is.
So, segment 1, the facade and the hidden life, this 7-year pattern of concealment.
Right. To get a handle on the motive the prosecution argued, you have to understand the image she cultivated. Lane was the daughter of Robert Lane, a retired police officer, and Sandra Lane, a former hospital worker.
So, a respectable background.
Yeah, a stable suburban Sydney family. And it seems the expectation, maybe the pressure of maintaining that public standing was just this overwhelming force in her life and her decisions.
And her own personal ambitions only added to that pressure, didn't they? She wasn't just playing water polo casual.
No. She was elite. She'd won a silver medal with the Australian junior women's team at the 95 World Championships in Quebec.
Wow.
Professionally, she had her degree, she was a teacher, a sports convener at the prestigious Ravenswood School for Girls. Everything about her projected image was about achievement, success, and, importantly, control.
And this control, it seems, extended into this incredibly secret life of, well, extreme biological denial.
That's a good way to put it. The prosecution later laid out how over 7 years, during the 1990s, Lane became pregnant 5 different times.
5 times.
And she systematically concealed every single one from her family, her friends, her partners. This wasn't, one isolated incident driven by panic. It was a sustained, calculated strategy.
5 pregnancies hidden over 7 years. That suggests such an intense emotional and physical toll. How did she manage to keep that facade intact?
Well, the record shows this kind of progression, getting better, perhaps, at concealment and control. The first 2 pregnancies were reportedly terminated.
Okay.
Then the pattern of carrying a baby to term and then effectively erasing the event started in 1995. She gave birth, placed that child for adoption,
Right.
and crucially, was back playing competitive water polo almost immediately, competing internationally just months after a full-term pregnancy. That shows a terrifying ability to compartmentalize and to physically recover without anyone apparently noticing.
That's just extraordinary. And what about the men in her life during this time? I mean, how do you hide multiple pregnancies from your partner?
Well, her partner throughout that key period from 94 to 98 was Duncan Gillies, a rugby union player. He later testified he was completely unaware of any of her pregnancies during their entire 4-year relationship.
Completely unaware.
That's what he said. It implies extreme effort on her part, hiding sickness, physical changes, absences. It really points to this deep, almost pathological fear she must have had about her reality being exposed.
And this pattern of deceit didn't stop after Tegan vanished in '96, did it? It continued, which really cemented the narrative the prosecution used later.
Precisely. That pattern was key. In 1999, she had her 5th secret pregnancy. She was 25 weeks along and actually flew to Queensland trying to get a late-term abortion.
But it was refused.
It was refused due to the viability of the fetus. So she gave birth to a boy 3 months later, put him up for adoption as well. And this event is critical because when she spoke to the social worker handling that adoption, she knowingly told them this was her first child.
Wow.
That documented lie, falsifying those records, became the foundation for the false declaration convictions she later faced alongside the murder charge.
So the ultimate collision point, the moment where these two lives couldn't coexist anymore, seems to be September 1996. And the pressure she was under must have been immense. You mentioned she tried to induce the birth early.
That's right. Tegan was born at Auburn Hospital on September 12, 1996. But we know Lane had been actively trying for an earlier birth. She'd had 4 failed attempts to be induced at Ryde Hospital before Tegan finally arrived.
Why the urgency?
Well, the prosecution argued that the timing was becoming critical, that the impending birth was incompatible with some non-negotiable event or commitment in her life, likely related to her water polo or just maintaining the overall facade.
And the disappearance itself happened incredibly quickly within a really critical time frame.
Yes, very quickly. Less than 2 days after the birth, on September 14th, she left Auburn Hospital with a Tegan. Records show that was between 11 a.m. and 12 p.m.
Okay.
By 3 p.m. that same afternoon, she arrived back at her parents' home in Manly. Critically, she was alone.
So the baby vanished sometime within that 3-hour window.
Exactly. Somewhere between leaving the hospital and arriving at her parents' house.
And the alibi, or rather the activity she engaged in just hours later, it speaks volumes about her priorities at that moment, doesn't it?
It really does. That same evening, September 14th, she attended a friend's wedding.
Just in white.
Dressed in white, with her partner Duncan Gillies, who was supposedly unaware of the birth.
Astonishing.
That image became absolutely central to the prosecution's motive argument. Here's this woman dressed in white, celebrating at a wedding, having, they argued, successfully erased the problem of a child born less than 48 hours before. Tegan was never mentioned, never seen by anyone at that wedding, or ever again.
The implication being Tegan represented an immediate threat to that carefully constructed aspirational life Lane was so desperate to maintain. Especially, perhaps, her athletic career.
That was the core argument. The Olympics were coming up in Sydney in 2000.
Right. Okay, that brings us to segment 2, the search for the missing child. And the complexity here, as you hinted, is that the search didn't actually begin in 1996 when Tegan disappeared.
No, and that delay is one of the most frustrating aspects for investigators. The police investigation wasn't triggered by Tegan's birth or disappearance in '96. It actually started because of the birth of the 1999 baby 3 years later.
How did that discovery happen?
It was down to a diligent Department of Community Services, or DOCS, child protection worker. They noticed inconsistencies in the 1999 adoption paperwork.
Specifically, the lie about it being her first child.
Exactly. That lie flagged something wasn't right. The worker did some digging, looked back through records, and first uncovered the 1996 birth of Tegan, and then went back further and found the 1995 birth and adoption as well.
So the system caught up with the hidden history. What happened when Lane was confronted?
When DOCS confronted her in October 1999, her first reaction was denial. She denied the 2 earlier children existed at all.
So Tegan's very existence was initially revealed through an administrative anomaly, not because someone reported a baby missing back in '96.
Precisely, which meant investigators were already years behind. Within days of that initial denial, though, Lane changed her story. She then claimed Tegan was alive and well, living with a family over in Perth.
Perth? That's a long way from Sydney.
It is, and that claim is what led DOCS to refer the matter to the local police. That referral sparked what became one of the longest, most extensive missing persons investigations in Australian history, all conducted essentially in hindsight.
And the police interviews, starting around 2001, they must have become crucial for the prosecution, especially given the inconsistencies.
Absolutely bedrock. In February 2001, police formally interviewed Lane. Ironically, she was actually 7 months pregnant at that time with her sixth child.
Sixth? Wow.
Yes, and this is where the narrative of Andrew Norris, sometimes she called him Morris, was introduced.
The alleged father.
The alleged father. Lane claimed Tegan was given to him. She described him as someone she had a brief affair with, meeting only on Friday nights in Balmain.
Okay, but wait. If she felt such shame about the pregnancies, why invent such a specific and ultimately traceable story? Names, locations. Why not just say it was a private, anonymous adoption or, heaven forbid, claim the baby had died?
Well, that's exactly the point the Crown seized upon. The intricate nature of the lie and the fact that it kept shifting was used by the prosecution to argue this wasn't just panic. It was, they argued, active fabrication. She was creating a narrative to absolve herself of responsibility.
And the details changed.
Almost immediately. First, she told police she handed Tegan over to Andrew Norris in the Auburn Hospital car park.
Okay.
Later, she changed that story. The handover happened inside, in the hospital foyer. She added details about Norris having a long-term partner named Melanie, claiming she'd seen Melanie's clothing, implying Melanie was part of his life.
Even though she supposedly only met him alone on Friday nights.
Right. The details didn't quite mesh, and they kept changing over subsequent interviews and statements. She gave, I think, 9 different versions of that day.
And what was her stated reason for all of this secrecy? What did she tell the police was the motivation?
She consistently maintained that she felt forced to hide the pregnancies because she had this intense, debilitating fear of how her conservative parents and her friends would react. She actually said, "I had no other choice but to hide the children, to erase them, to maintain her life, her status."
So the need to manage her reputation, her image, was presented as the overwhelming driving force.
According to her, yes. And the prosecution argued that this driving force was strong enough to lead to murder.
Okay, the shifting narrative, the lack of a body, it inevitably led to a coronial inquest, which happened much later, 2005 to 2006. What was the official outcome there?
State Coroner John Abernethy presided over that. He heard a huge amount of evidence, all the police efforts, DNA matching attempts, the failed leads. His conclusion was both definitive and yet cautious.
How so?
He stated he was comfortably satisfied that Tegan Lane is in fact deceased. That was a major finding. And importantly, he expressed concern that she had met with foul play.
But he didn't completely rule out the possibility she was alive.
Correct. He acknowledged that, theoretically, a remote possibility still existed that she could be alive somewhere, undetected. But based on the evidence before him, he ordered a death certificate be issued.
Which is a significant step.
A huge procedural step. And he formally recommended that all the evidence, the pattern of deceit, the failed searches, be immediately forwarded to the New South Wales Homicide Squad to consider murder charges.
So the coroner basically said, she's likely dead, likely murdered. Investigate this as a homicide.
In essence, yes.
The police investigation in the years following that inquest sounds incredibly thorough. They really tried to either prove Lane's story or find Tegan, didn't they?
The effort from 2006 onward, spurred by the coroner's findings, was just monumental. Investigators poured vast resources into trying to locate this mythical Norris family.
Andrew Norris, Melanie, Nana Norris.
Exactly. They followed up on every single one of Lane's, I think it was 9, documented versions of the handover story. They cross-referenced databases, property records, driver's licenses, electoral rolls, everything, right across Australia, trying to find any trace of these people.
And they found nothing.
Absolutely nothing matching the descriptions, names, and timelines Lane provided.
Were there specific contradictions in her stories that helped dismantle the Norris narrative?
Yes, subtle things sometimes. For instance, police looked into a possible sighting of Andrew Norris at the Sydney Aquarium. It seemed like maybe a lead.
Okay.
But Lane herself apparently dismissed it, reportedly saying Andrew had no interest in water. Now, that detail might seem small, but the police saw it as her providing information designed to sound plausible, but which didn't hold up, or could be used to shut down lines of inquiry. The geographical details she gave also shifted and sometimes conflicted. It just wasn't the story of a straightforward, albeit secret, handover.
And the efforts to find Tegan herself, the child, they weren't just focused on Sydney or this Norris family.
Oh, far from it. This is where you see the incredible scale of the investigation. Police conducted a 2-year systematic search of primary school records.
How many schools?
Over 9,000 primary schools right across Australia. They were looking for any Tegan Lane or similar names who would have been school-aged.
9,000 schools.
Yeah. They followed up specific leads, 2 girls named Tegan Lane in Queensland, even a possible match on a remote Torres Strait island. Every single potential lead was investigated and ultimately excluded. Tegan wasn't in the system.
So the failure of these massive nationwide searches to find any trace of a child who should have been in school or at least registered somewhere really strengthened the police view that she wasn't alive.
It had to. The total lack of any record, any contact, any trace, combined with Lane's proven lies. It led investigators and eventually the DPP to believe that the only reasonable inference left was that Keli Lane had disposed of Tegan's body and fabricated the entire Norris story to cover it up.
So if the police had done all this work but still lacked that definitive physical evidence, what pushed it over the line to actually charging her with murder? That feels like a really big and perhaps risky legal step.
It was a huge step. The police compiled their massive brief of evidence and referred the whole thing to the Director of Public Prosecutions, Nicholas Cowdery. His decision, which came down on November 17, 2009, to charge Lane with murder. Well, it was widely described in legal circles as an unusual step.
Because of the lack of a body?
Primarily, yes, and the lack of any direct forensic evidence linking her to a death. It was pushing the boundaries of what circumstantial evidence alone could achieve in a murder trial.
So what was the key legal hurdle the DPP felt they could overcome?
They had to believe they could convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Their argument essentially became, look at the totality of the lies, look at the calculated pattern of behavior over years, look at the exhaustive failed searches. The possibility of Tegan being alive, given all this, is so remote, so unsupported by any evidence that it's unreasonable.
So the argument was, Keli Lane is the only one who knows what happened to Tegan.
Right.
Every explanation she's given is a demonstrable lie. Therefore, the only logical conclusion left standing is murder.
That was the inference they asked the jury to draw. And this reliance on inference drawn from behavior, from lies, from abscess, rather than positive proof of death, that's what made the 2010 trial so significant and, well, controversial.
Which brings us neatly to segment 3, the trial, motive, and sentencing. This trial took place in the Supreme Court before Justice Anthony Wheely. The Crown prosecution knew their biggest challenge was establishing a motive powerful enough to convince a jury without that physical evidence.
Absolutely. Mark Tedeschi, GC, led the Crown's case. He focused almost entirely on Lane's obsession with protecting her reputation and her ambition.
How did they build that case?
They meticulously presented the evidence of the 5 secret pregnancies, the 2 prior adoptions, the 2 terminations. They painted it as proof of the sustained, systematic desire to eliminate any obstacle, any child that threatened her goals or her image.
So the motive argued wasn't necessarily hatred or malice towards the baby itself.
No, not directly. It was framed as the desperate need to maintain her life, her status, her ambitions.
Particularly the sporting ambitions.
The Crown strongly argued that yes, that she was prepared to abandon children, or worse, to protect her image and increase her chances of representing Australia in water polo at the Sydney 2000 Olympics. The motive became about the self-preservation of her status and her future plans.
And that wedding attendance.
That became the powerful symbol of her success in achieving that goal. Attending the wedding just hours after leaving the hospital with Tegan was presented as the final chilling proof that she had found what the Crown called a permanent solution to the problem that Tegan represented.
How did the defense respond to this portrayal? They couldn't deny the concealment, could they?
No, the defense had to acknowledge the concealment, but they tried to frame it differently. Legal commentary around the trial, sometimes citing Justice Peter Hamill, who had actually defended Lane back in the 2006 inquest, highlighted the argument that revealing what was described as the salaciousness of her sex life, involving numerous rugby players, would have utterly destroyed her image, especially given her father's position as president of the Manly Marlins Rugby Club.
So they argued the concealment was about shame, about keeping secrets from her family, but not necessarily murder.
Exactly. Rooted in shame and reputation management, yes. Murder, no. That was the line they tried to hold.
The trial concluded dramatically on December 13, 2010. Can you walk us through how the jury reached the final verdict?
Well, the jury came back first with a verdict on the lesser charges. They found her guilty on all 3 counts of making a false declaration, those lies about the 2 babies she did adopt out.
So they clearly accepted the pattern of deceit.
Unanimously. That showed they believed she was capable of elaborate, sustained lying about her children. However, they then indicated they were deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous verdict on the murder charge itself.
Ah, okay, so what happens then?
Justice Wheely, following the procedure allowed in New South Wales, then gave the jury what's called a majority verdict direction. He advised them they could return a verdict if 11 out of the 12 jurors agreed.
And did they reach a majority verdict soon after?
They did. Later that same day, the jury returned with an 11-1 majority verdict, finding Keli Lane guilty of the murder of Tegan.
So ultimately, 11 jurors concluded that her pattern of lies, her inability to provide any credible alternative explanation, and the complete lack of any trace of Tegan meant the only reasonable conclusion, beyond reasonable doubt, was that she killed her daughter.
That's what the verdict implies, yes. The weight of the circumstantial evidence, the lies, the motive, was enough for 11 of them.
And during the sentencing phase, there was some significant psychiatric evidence presented, wasn't there? It provided a pretty chilling context.
Yes, psychiatrist Michael Diamond gave expert evidence for the Crown. His finding was crucial. He found no evidence of a psychiatric disorder in Keli Lane.
Why was that so significant?
Because it essentially neutralized any potential argument for diminished responsibility due to mental illness, like severe postpartum depression or psychosis.
Right.
Instead, Dr. Diamond concluded that Lane's decisions, including the concealment and, by implication, what happened to Tegan, were based on problem solving.
That phrase, problem solving, applied to a newborn baby. It's horrifying.
It is deeply disturbing, but it spoke directly to the Crown's narrative that her actions weren't impulsive or driven by uncontrollable mental distress. They were perceived by the court as cold, calculated, systematic decisions where her career, her image, her social standing were prioritized above everything else, including her child's life.
And the sentence reflected that severity.
It did. On April 15, 2011, Justice Wheatley sentenced Keli Lane to 18 years in jail with a non-parole period, meaning she would first become eligible for release on May 12, 2024.
Which brings us right up to the present-day legal situation and into segment 4. Appeals and legal impediments.
Lane didn't waste any time appealing, did she? No, she lodged an appeal almost immediately, just 3 days after sentencing. And this was happening amidst a huge media frenzy around the case.
I remember there were some sensational claims around that time, too.
Yes, coincided with unconfirmed but widely reported media claims that a taxi driver had suddenly remembered seeing Lane dump a baby in bushland on the way to Manly on that critical day back in '96.
Was that ever substantiated?
Never substantiated, no, but it certainly fueled the intense public interest and probably hardened public opinion against her just as the appeal process was starting.
But despite the public noise, the formal appeals process moved through the courts and systematically upheld the conviction.
It did. The New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal heard her initial appeal over a period between 2011 and 2013. They ultimately dismissed it entirely.
What was the reasoning?
They stated quite explicitly that there was ample evidence available to the trial jury to conclude Lane was guilty. They essentially validated the strength of the circumstantial case built by the DPP and accepted by the jury.
So her last legal resort was the High Court.
Yes, her final opportunity was to seek special leave to appeal to the High Court of Australia. That application was formally rejected in August 2014.
And the significance of that rejection.
It meant the end of the legal road for challenging the conviction itself. It legally affirmed that in Australia, a murder conviction can be secured based on systematic deceit and motive, even in the complete absence of a body or direct physical evidence. A landmark outcome.
So if her legal challenges to the conviction itself ended in 2014, the final, really devastating legal reality kicked in just recently, in 2024, with the no body, no parole consequence. You mentioned she was denied parole in March 2024.
That's right. This is the tough current reality for Keli Lane. New South Wales has specific legislation, often called the No Body, No Parole Law. Its formal name is the Crimes Administration of Sentences Amendment, No Body, No Parole Act.
And how does that law actually work? For our listeners, it's not just about extra punishment, is it?
No, it's framed differently. It's designed as a mechanism to compel cooperation from offenders after conviction. The focus shifts from punishment to disclosure, specifically about the location of the victim's remains.
So, to get parole.
To satisfy the state parole authority, the SPA, and be granted release, an offender like Lane, convicted of murder where the body hasn't been found, must demonstrate that she has cooperated satisfactorily in police investigations to locate the victim's remains.
And therein lies the catch-22 for Keli Lane.
Precisely. Since she continues to maintain her innocence of the murder itself and insists Tegan was handed over to Andrew Norris, a story the courts have definitively judged to be a fabrication, she cannot possibly satisfy the condition of cooperating to locate Tegan's remains.
Because according to her story, there are no remains to locate.
Exactly. She maintains Tegan is alive somewhere. So, by sticking to the narrative that was rejected by the courts, she legally prevents herself from meeting the criteria for parole under this specific law.
So because Tegan remains missing and Lane won't renounce her original story, she's effectively locked in until her maximum sentence expires.
That appears to be the situation. She remains incarcerated at the Silverwater Women's Correctional Center. Unless there's a dramatic change, either she suddenly provides a location for Tegan, or perhaps Tegan miraculously turns up alive, she will likely remain in jail until her full 18-year sentence expires on December 12, 2028. Her adherence to the Norris story is, ironically, the legal bar to her own freedom now.
And her time inside the prison system hasn't been quiet either. There's been more public attention, hasn't there?
Yes, her case resurfaced significantly in the public eye with the 2018 ABC three-part documentary series, Exposed, the case of Keli Lane.
I remember that. It re-examined the evidence, didn't it?
It did. It raised some questions about the strength of the purely circumstantial case, and it gave the public a fairly unusual glimpse into her perspective, featuring edited segments of phone calls she made from jail. 6-minute calls, heavily edited, but still her voice heard publicly.
And then, even more recently, this year, in 2025, some very serious allegations emerged about her treatment while she was incarcerated.
That's right. Earlier this year, New South Wales MLC Sue Higginson brought forward allegations from Lane herself. Lane alleged that she had been repeatedly sexually assaulted and harassed by staff while she was held at the Dilwyn Correctional Center.
And she named someone.
Yes, she specifically named a corrections officer, Wayne Estill. And this detail is significant because Estill was actually jailed himself back in 2023 for assaulting multiple other incarcerated women at that same facility.
Wow.
And reports suggest Lane was actually a key witness in the internal government inquiry into Estill's conduct. So it adds another layer of complexity and difficulty to the ongoing reality of her life inside the prison system.
It's just, the whole case is such a stark example, isn't it? Intense personal secrecy, overwhelming ambition colliding with reality, a complete failure by police despite massive efforts to find any physical proof, and then a legal system willing to push the boundaries.
Willing to charge and ultimately convict based entirely on patterns of behavior, on character, on motive, on lies.
So if we try to synthesize the key insights here for our listeners, what stands out most?
Well, I think the conviction itself has to be seen as a legal milestone. It was built, fundamentally, on proving an overwhelming self-serving motive, the protection of reputation, the pursuit of ambition, and meticulously documenting that systematic pattern of behavior over years: deceit, abandonment, erasure.
And the prosecution's success hinged on convincing the jury
That the sheer volume of proven lies, particularly about the Norris family, combined with the absolute failure of that huge 9,000 school search and every other investigation to find any trace of Tegan, rendered any other outcome, like Tegan simply being alive and hidden, totally inconsistent with the standard of reasonable doubt.
So the power of this verdict really lies in the court's acceptance, ultimately confirmed by the High Court, that where physical evidence of death is completely missing.
A documented pattern of calculated, deceitful actions aimed specifically at eliminating the deceased person's existence from the narrative can, in itself, constitute sufficient evidence of murder. It really does shift our understanding of how behavior alone can meet that very high burden of proof in a capital case.
Absolutely. The High Court's refusal to hear the final appeal essentially cemented that principle in Australian law. Circumstantial evidence, if strong enough, if pointing overwhelmingly in one direction, can be legally sufficient for a murder conviction, even without a body. Provided, of course, that the inference drawn that the victim is dead and the accused is responsible is the only reasonable inference left on the table.
It sets a fascinating, and some would argue concerning, precedent.
Which leads us perfectly into our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to perhaps mull over. The case against Keli Lane relied so heavily on circumstantial evidence about her character, her motives, her consistent pattern of denial and deceit, rather than any traditional forensic proof of death or disposal.
There was no smoking gun, no DNA, no body.
Exactly. So, considering the immense gravity of a murder conviction and the finality of the court's decision here, how heavily should the legal system rely on a documented history of lies and a powerful, albeit inferred, motive to determine guilt in capital cases? And maybe more pointedly, what does the Keli Lane case truly imply for that fundamental standard of beyond reasonable doubt, when the primary evidence presented is the total, calculated, and successful erasure of a human life from all records?